Hello there, world, wherever you are. Welcome once again to the There Will Be Geek podcast. I'm Mike.
I'm Cav.
And I'm Chani.
And this week we will be discussing the wonderful thing that is Preacher. Both the TV adaptation recently aired and also the comic books. And we're going to be delving into things to do with the writers of the original material, what we think of the new piece, some of the themes, and so on and so forth. There's a whole bunch of stuff we'll be discussing later on. Meanwhile, to start off with, as usual, we're going to start off with our Thimble of Win. So, Cav, and I think to an extent, Chani, what has tickled your geek fancy this week?
Doom. Oh, fuck, it's good. Oh, fuck, it's so good. Yeah, it's really not bad.
Do I need to leave you two alone with some tissues?
No, just big guns. Big guns. Big guns and guts.
Oh my
Big guts.
God, it's so gory.
Oh, it's going into it. I mean, the idea of a new Doom. I was always a little bit leery about it because, I mean, taking these old... It's the same with movies or anything else. They take these old franchises, they bring them back. You know, most times it doesn't work. They don't quite capture what was so great about the original. They have fucking nailed it with this game. It is fantastic.
So much.
I mean, look, we're talking about the single player here. The multiplayer, it's all right.
I haven't delved into that yet. I haven't done it.
So you two need to be playing each other on this one, really.
I mean, there was a multiplayer beta. I didn't think much of it, but the single player is just no fucking perfect. It just captures... It's updated. They've updated a lot of the mechanics, but in really clever ways. But they've kept the feel of those original games where you just enter the zen state. Like, it's so finely tuned. You actually stop thinking about what you're doing. And it's this experience.
Yeah.
You know? And it's just, it's violent as fuck. The story's actually quite well done. It's just subtle enough. And with enough sort of cheeky humor in there to stop it from getting too po-faced. Mm-hmm. It's just... absolutely wonderful. I'm still surprised, to be honest with you.
I love all the extra stuff that comes with it. Like, it's not just, you go from point A to point B, but there's all these little tiny little secret places that you can find where you can find like all the different kinds of upgrades, or you can find the little they're little bobblehead dudes. I can't remember what they're actually specifically called, but they're like these little bobbleheads, and then they unlock content for you, and then there's like even you can unlock and find like classic Doom maps and go back and play those. And
those are incredible,
It's so weird when you actually find the classic Doom room, because you're in this world that's like fully rendered in 3D graphics. It's pretty, and there's like blood dripping around everywhere, and then you walk into this room where it's got graphics from like 1995. And it's so weird.
And it's literally, there's a secret door will open somewhere, and on the other side, it's like 1995.
Yeah.
And you can just walk in and out and look at it. It's bizarre, but it's so well done.
Oh, it's so good. And they've also got this new, like, snap map. I haven't checked this out yet, but I'm going to delve into it because I'm like, I love Sims. I love building shit. Not Minecraft, though. Fuck Minecraft. I'm going to get hate for that. But... these snap maps, you can make all of these different kinds of maps and stuff that you can share with other people, or you can play theirs. And like, I'm so excited to get into that, but I just want to find all the upgrades and everything first.
I tried a bit of snap map, but it seems cool so far. You know, people are uploading their own maps, making their own little games. Anyone who's played Little Big Planet?
Oh yeah!
Imagine that. It's kind of Little Big Planet Doom style. It seems pretty cool.
Blood and guts and...
yeah.
Awesome!
Okay.
Big fucking planet.
Yeah! Oh my god, the BFG! The BFG! Oh! It's so good. And the chainsaw, and the gory kills. Ooh!
So I'm taking it that you two really, really enjoyed Doom then.
Yeah, it wasn't bad.
Now, I can play it again.
Well, okay, well that kind of, that deals with your Thimble of Win rather well. Mine's not quite as big, but it's still a fairly big win as far as I'm concerned, and that is the announcement and the trailer for, well, the teaser trailer for the upcoming CBS Star Trek TV series. Now, we know next to nothing about that for the moment, other than it's scheduled at the moment for release in January 2017, so in just over 6 months' time. I, for one, am really excited about this because whilst there is the upcoming film adaptation, Star Trek Beyond, that looks like it's going to be potentially quite a lot of fun. It's been written by Simon Pegg, who's kind of one of my writing heroes as it is anyway. That's all well and good, but Star Trek needs to be on the television, because the sort of stories that it can tell in terms of the conundrums it deals with, the mirror it can hold up to current issues, the concepts it can deal with, you will deal with so much better in a regular television show in a world that is being built. Whereas a film series that you see beautiful versions of, but once every few years, and also one that at the moment seems to be very beholden to the past franchise in the sense of the past movies, that doesn't quite deal with it as well as it could. So the idea of there being another new Star Trek series really, really pleases me, and I'm excited by the possibility. I really hope it's good. But that trailer, that piqued my interests. Those 4 notes, the doom, 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 that's enough. That's enough to just go, whoa, yes, yes. And it could be rubbish, it could be terrible, it could be wonderful, I don't know, but it's going to be there, and that's an important thing.
Yeah, in a weird way, Star Trek, I think, has always belonged on TV. I mean, the movies have generally been great, but I think it's more that world and the type of world-building Star Trek's always had. It's always felt more comfortable on TV, where it can take its time and sink you into the world a bit more. It's not quite as much about fast action and whiz-bang and sort of the very kind of impact-based storytelling that movies require. Yeah. It's hopefully, fingers crossed, that it does work out, because I think it'd be the best thing, definitely.
Oh, absolutely. It should be great. Anyway, moving on. Our main subject for discussion today is going to be Preacher, both the recent TV adaptation of the original source material and some discussion based around the original source material itself. Now, first thing I wanted to bring us towards is the TV adaptation. Cav, you've seen this week, and I watched this as well. What did you think?
I liked it. It was weird, because, I mean, as I guess most fans of Preacher know, most people who know comics, they've been trying to adapt this thing for pretty much ever since the comic series first began, which was like 20-something years ago.
Yeah, with the comic book series ran from 1996 to 2001.
Yeah. And, I mean, there's been a lot of people who've tried cracking this one. I mean, I know Sam Mendes was connected to it for a while. Several directors. No one could sort of get it right. And it's actually Seth Rogen and his writing partner who've wound up actually doing it as a TV show. And the first episode was pretty good. Very different. They've changed a lot of things around. It's quite different to the first issue of the comic, the way the main character, Jesse Custer, is introduced, how the other characters are introduced. But in ways I think do work. I mean, the comic starts off sort of literally with a bang and throws you into this crazy story. And I think they recognize that with long-term storytelling for TV, that might not have the same effect.
I think one of the other good things I've seen about this TV adaptation, though, so far is it has a very comic sensibility. I mean, both in terms of comedy, but also in terms of the comic books elements to it. Because there are, for example, the very first shot you see is outer space, and it's literally with the word outer space written on there. And there are elements of ridiculous, overblown, very comic booky looking scenes within this first show already that are done very well for comic effect and kind of deliberately hark back to the original. So, for example, as well, unlike other AMC adaptations such as The Walking Dead, this is not going to be going for a kind of as gritty and as po-faced a thing as you could possibly go. They're actually including some of the initial comic, I hate to say the word zaniness, but that kind of thing, the comedic elements to the original stories, and it's doing it in as subtle a way as possible while still keeping as much realism to the character.
There's that off-kilter kind of humour that the comic very much had. The word punk was always brought up with Preacher, and it actually is again for this first episode as well. And very true, the way Punk had that very sarcastic, irreverent kind of sense of humour.
Yeah.
Which is the kind of sense of humour I think you don't see as much nowadays in popular culture, and I've kind of missed. And they've captured that very well, and it kind of makes sense now that why you would get comedians to adapt this thing, because they tap straight into that, certainly.
Well, on top of that as well, I think, and this is something we're going to deal with a little bit more later on, this is something that kind of needs to have the adaptation it's having. A film would never have told the story, or even a series of films would never have told the story accurately enough, because it is a wide-ranging story arc in general from the comic books. Because of the success of HBO properties like Game of Thrones, but also things like the Netflix adaptations of various different other Marvel properties like Daredevil and Jessica Jones, those have opened the door for this kind of storytelling to be done. But we'll deal with that a little bit more later on. Shani, what do you get with this?
Well, to be honest, I've never actually seen Preacher or read the comics. I've done a little bit of research prior to this episode, just finding out, what the story is and what's going on and what it is that everyone's talking about. But it does pique my interest as something that I would be interested in watching. Like, it's got that whole gritty kind of feel to it, but at the same time, it does have some laughable elements that I was like, what? No, that's not going to happen, but it does. So I always enjoy things that have that kind of dark humor that other people don't always latch on to.
And this is the thing, looking at this, particularly, for example, with the introduction of the character Cassidy, it's from the word go in the TV adaptation, Cassidy is a vampire. We know that very, very early on. But he's not your traditional idea of a vampire. So again, it's established quite early on that holy water makes next to no difference to this character. But sunlight does. And his over-the-topness as a character and his sarcasm and darkness and wit and brio right the way through is fantastic. Again, the casting they've got is brilliant. We've got 2 Irish people and 2 Brits in some of the lead roles. Dominic Cooper and Ruth Negga are excellent, pretty much for the word go. And Dominic Cooper is surprisingly understated in the role of Jesse. I'm used to some of the stuff he's done previously in Mamma Mia, his role in The Devil's Double, his turn as Howard Stark in both the Marvel movies and the TV adaptations like Agent Carter. And to see him kind of tone everything down as Jesse for the moment, that's actually really refreshing.
I really like that, yeah. Have you seen with the kid who's getting beaten up by his dad, and the kid comes to and asks for help. And because he has a criminal past, and he knows the kid knows this, he knows that what the kid's basically asking is, would you beat the shit out of my dad? And there's a scene where he actually plays through it, describing how it would go. Well, he's a big guy who would take more than one punch, and he'll have his mates with him. Where's that going to go? And you can see that temptation come through, and almost that sort of that thirst for violence that sort of he's been trying to tamp down since he became a preacher. And that change of him suddenly going, no, it would be pointless. And it was very well played. And I think it's something that, yeah, it takes a while to emerge in the comic, and I like they've brought it right to the forefront now, because I think it helps establish his sort of conflict, which I think, to be honest with you, I reread through the comics recently. I think that's one of the aspects that didn't work for me as well on this read-through. That sort of conflict between his criminal past and his own sort of baser urges. And no, he played that very well. And I think that this more understated sort of version, it works well as well because it's a crazy story. No matter how much they change, this is a fucking nuts story. You need to bring the general audience in, and I think it's a nice way to lead into it.
Which leads us nicely on into the comics themselves. Now, one of the very first things, again, I'm trying not to be too much of a spoiler for those people who haven't seen the TV versions, one of the first things we see is something landing on Earth, and something going into a church and taking over the body of a preacher in Africa. And let's just say that thing does not end up kind of giving this guy any wonderful powers or anything else like that. It ends very explosively. And it's an ongoing thing throughout the episode. And this is the thing that in the comics, we have this idea that something has escaped from heaven. Literally heaven. Something has escaped from heaven and comes down to Earth and ends up inhabiting the body of Jesse Custer. And this is the whole point, because Jesse Custer is then given this amazing gift where he has the word of God on his lips and can say to someone to do something and they will do it, no matter how strange it might be. So, for example, he might go up to somebody and say, lick your own balls, and they do so.
Yeah, think of it as a really highly over-leveled Jedi mind trick. Is pretty much what he's got.
It's probably a good thing that I don't have powers like this. It'd probably make everyone just wear underwear on their heads while doing the chicken dance or something.
See, I'm picturing that now, and I can't imagine that going down well in your office. Although it would make for interesting television here. So yes, the comics. The comics themselves were some of my first introduction to comics at all. I was very late to the party person with comics in general. It's only since the last 2 or 3 years, mostly down to the influence of my wonderful fiancée Kerry, who was a big fan, that I ended up getting into them at all. The first thing I ended up going through was Transmetropolitan. And I found Transmetropolitan to be wonderful.
That's the dude with the glasses, isn't it?
Exactly, Spider Jerusalem. And then after Transmetropolitan, I was introduced to Sandman and Preacher. And then later on, The Boys and some other adaptations. It's fantastic. But Preacher really had a massive impact on me because and this is the thing, I was able to go through it all at once. Because Kerry had the kind of the books with all of the full 9-edition story, and I had all of this world to be able to absorb at once, and it was beautiful because it was insane. It was graphic. It was very, very, very heretical, very, very iconoclastic. It tore people down. It tore assumptions down. It tore concepts and philosophies down massively, straight away from the word go. And it was really I can understand the kind of arresting impact it would have had around about the time that it was released. And you encountered it when it was released, Cav.
Yeah, I jumped on the train towards the end of the original run. This was when I was at uni in Perth. And yeah, it was a similar thing, basically. Like we have a similar background. We were brought up Catholic.
Yes.
And I think a lot of it was the impact of having this alternative version of how everything works up there, because we've been brought up with the church-approved version of how it works, which isn't really very specific at all. And it was this different vision of it. And yeah, it had a huge impact on me. It was hugely influential. I remember when the last issue came out, me and my good mate Travis Johnson, who showed up on our discussion group a few days ago, this article on filming about the new Ghostbusters trailer, we actually bought the final issue and went to a bar and read it together.
That sounds cool.
On that, so it was kind of cute, really, thinking back on it. Very drunken, and very scruffy, but,
Which sounds entirely appropriate for the source material, considering.
Yeah. And we just sort of, went through that final issue together. It was a huge, huge deal, yeah.
See, this is the thing as well. We look at this, and it's not like Preacher didn't suddenly just appear from nowhere. This was something that had clearly been something that had been in the minds of the writers for a while. This is something that was created by Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon, who are a couple of legendary writers. And, Garth Ennis, the writer, Steve Dillon, the illustrator, and they've been working together and working within the world of comics for a while before that. They both worked on 2000 AD. They both worked on Judge Dredd. They worked on Hellblazer together. They ended up working on The Punisher for Marvel as well.
Yeah, one thing that really struck me reading through it again is just how much of the 2000 AD feel transferred over to Preacher. Like, it could almost have been, a 2000 AD story that just happened to have been made in America. And like a lot of those other books as well. The same thing, like how much that sort of, that little movement that 2000 AD sparked off moved over into the Vertigo thing and really influenced that.
So yes, that's it. And also, just a complete aside, Steve Dillon is also responsible for one of the most ridiculous characters I've ever encountered. My particular species of fandom, my main source of fandom and my main way into fandom in general was always via Doctor Who. And Steve Dillon created the character of Absalom Dark, Dalek Killer, in Doctor Who magazine. So that's kind of cool there. Right. And that comes, obviously, that will also link back into some other things with regards to the kind of the British sensibility and the British humour that comes into this American property, which we'll deal with a little bit later on. We've also got amazing themes that run right the way throughout this. We deal with the idea of organised religion, themes of good and evil, themes of family and history and grudges being held and revenge, crime and this idea of an absent god, the idea of sacrifice as well, which comes in later on in the series with regards to the origins of the character of Cassidy, this Irish mentalist who runs right the way through. We've got the Grail, this organisation of kind of secretive people who all are supposed to be looking after the bloodline of Jesus Christ. And they're trying to track down Jesse Custer. And so many people are trying to track down Jesse Custer because they suddenly realize what he's got and what he can do with it. Jesse himself ends up going on a quest to find God and to have words with him. And it comes back, one of the things that comes back, comes back to, there's a quote from, I'm going to paraphrase this, but this is from Epicurus, who is a Greek philosopher who was alive from like 341 BCE to 270 BCE. And it comes down to this concept, and a large chunk of this seems to inform a lot of Garth Ennis's writing. So this idea of, is God willing to prevent evil, but not able, which would mean he's not omnipotent? Is he able, but not willing? Well, then he's malevolent. Is he able and willing? Then where does evil come from? And if he's neither able nor willing, well, why call him God? And so much of this this strong atheism comes right the way through a lot of the other work that Ennis produces as well, this idea, and he really kind of gets to grips with this as much as possible by asking questions right the way throughout Preacher. And on top of that, there's also wonderful little cultural asides in there, little moments of history. So we have an entire section of it where it's just got Jesse and Cassidy discussing Bill Hicks and having gone to see him. You've got Cassidy's history as a vampire and where he comes from and where he's ended up and what he's got up to in the intervening time, because it turns out he's a lot older than you think. You've got this wonderful dark past history between Jesse and Tulip. Tulip being this girl who he'd been with and he's left to come back and become this preacher, but they've got this really shady past together. I mean, in the comics as well, I love the fact that basically the difference between past Jesse and new Jesse is new Jesse has a dog collar and a dog lace and a shoelace tie. The rest of the time, he still looks exactly the same in his black t-shirt and his white jeans.
Yeah.
And his bad Texan mullet. But it is interesting to look at some of the Preacher deals with these themes. And it was one of the first really it's not necessarily the first publication to ever cover these themes, because frankly, I mean, this goes right the way back to Byron, God knows how. I mean, I'm talking about Epicurus here. This goes back to Greek philosophers of 2,500 years ago. But within my lifetime, it's one of these first properties where you start to see these questions being raised in mainstream literature, or getting towards mainstream publications. And it's the challenging of the status quo. It's, again, particularly for, like I say, mine and Cav's upbringing, the challenging of widely and strongly held religious beliefs. This idea that God is not necessarily this wonderful, caring being, but is in fact somewhat of an absentee landlord.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where then coming back to the comics after, it would be 15, almost 20 years, me as a 40-year-old as opposed to me as a 23, 24-year-old film student, a lot of the exploration of those things were quite surface in the comic. But at the same time, they can't be denied the fact that it was the first time in a lot of ways that these things had been brought up in mainstream comics. I mean, and that alone for its impact.
And this is the other thing as well. I mean, even when we first found out about the idea of a Preacher adaptation, we were thinking, I can't do that. No, because the issues, I mean, particularly this is an American cable TV show, and the issues it deals with and the way approach it has to what it says with regards to God is still something that people now are slightly shady about. In the, you can't say that. Oh, how are American TV audiences going to deal with this? How is America in general going to react to this? Because we know all about how very religious large chunks of America is. Exactly, and it's an exciting possibility. Funnily enough, the parallel I would bring to this is, oddly enough, Father Ted. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Father Ted is a sitcom based around the lives of three priests off the coast of Ireland in the mid-90s, and it was a show produced by Channel 4. It was chunks of it were filmed in Ireland, just on location, but a large chunk of it, the vast majority of it, was filmed in England, despite its large Irish cast and production team, because of the fact that there were fears that it would not go down well in the staunchly conservative and fiercely Catholic country of Ireland. And there were genuine worries about whether or not they were going to be able to say some of the things they were doing about the priesthood and priests in general, even though it was very much a comedy. There were genuine concerns about it. And I would say that there are similar concerns that a lot of people have had with the idea of some of the things that the source material Preacher says about God and religion in America.
I think there's differences as well. I mean, Father Ted, I think, got away with a lot of it because it was so intentionally silly and whimsical.
Yes.
That it was endearing. It focused on the endearing side. I think Preacher comes from a very 90s style of comedy where there's actually almost some kind of revolutionary intent behind it. There's an aggression behind it. There's an intent to really go out and criticize. Bill Hicks comes into it, and it's very much molded from his style of humor, which was extremely influential in the 90s. So it'll be interesting, because in so many ways, Preacher, it was about anachronism in a lot of ways in the first place, you know, about John Wayne and these old sort of Hollywood masculine values. And in the modern age, because it's such a product of the 90s, it's sort of an extra layer of anachronism as well.
Yeah.
But there is also that aspect, too, of it could still be very inflammatory. So
Yes.
in a weird way, it's still vital while being twice as anachronistic. It's weird, but it's a really good kind of weird, though. It's going to be very interesting.
Now, this is the thing. We're moving on. What do we think the future of the show is going to be? Because we do know that there are issues with regards to adaptation. And again, there were issues with regards to The Walking Dead. And more or less anytime you get every kind of literary adaptation, there are going to be compromises that are necessary, whether it be a book adaptation or a comic book adaptation, which has been happening more and more recently. We all know only too well about some of the issues there have been with taking some things like Game of Thrones, the book series of A Song of Ice and Fire, and where that goes with regards to what you can then put into the TV and what sacrifices have to be made. Where do we think it's going with this one then?
I think, the first episode has been very noticeable for the fact that it does go off book so much. And I actually think in this case, it could actually be a good idea to sort of do that, to stay true to the source material, but tailor it more for the TV audience. The comic is very idiosyncratic. It may have been revolutionary, but it is steeped in a lot of comic book style storytelling that I think other adaptations have struggled with.
I was just thinking, because Preacher has finished, hasn't it? Like the comic book, that
Yes.
is done. Like there's no more. So they've got like a whole story that they can tell, whereas with Game of Thrones, that isn't finished. So they can take liberties to, change it up, and people can kind of just deal with it because they don't know if that is actually going to happen or not because it hasn't been written. Whereas when you've got something that's fully like put together already and available, I think that's when people start getting a bit more touchy about it because they're like, no, it's not supposed to be like that. It has to be like this. And whether they stick to that or not could prove a big point on whether the show will actually stay successful or not.
Yeah, I actually think with this one, it could be a boon because the comic run is relatively short. I know reading through it again, I did notice that towards the end especially, the pace quickened up, and I'm not going to say it felt rushed, but there are a lot of things that you could really sort of draw out more, I think, in an ongoing TV series. Things like, more about, the nature of good and evil. In the comic, it ultimately breaks down to these very sort of John Wayne anachronistic masculine values, and that becomes almost the answer to everything. You can draw that out a bit more. And even things like, we get hints of how heaven is run. We meet angels, we meet, I guess, the equivalent of admin guys in heaven, and we don't really see them for very much in the comic. And those are things that, you could really draw out a bit more and paint more of a picture of, okay, here's this new vision of how heaven actually works. Run with that a bit as well and bring that in more and more material in that, because I would have liked to have actually seen a bit more of that in the comic. So there's definitely lots of scope.
Well, I think one of the things that also helps with regards to this is the writers are on board. For example, I just posted a link recently into our Facebook discussion group where there is an interview with Garth Ennis about the adaptation, and he seems quite optimistic. And the fact that he's on board, him and Steve Dillon are on board as executive producers, means that they are at least going to be kind of there and on hand and consultable were changes in adaptations to be made, which gives you hope for the way this could work in the future. And I think we've already had this discussion off air about the influence of the fact that this is very much, it's an American property and it's set very much in an American area, but it's got British authors and that kind of British sensibility. And I mean, going back to adaptations, for example, we always know that there are going to be issues between adaptations and films. And the one that I think comes up a lot of times in geek circles is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You have 4 different iterations of that. You have the radio series to start off with, the book series, the TV show, and then later on the film, which sadly Douglas Adams died whilst it was in the process of being made. And each one of them is distinct and wildly different from the other, whilst having a lot of the central themes.
I know, reading the comic through again, I got reminded of Douglas Adams, especially Hitchhikers, because Hitchhikers has that same thing. It's this huge, sprawling story with millions of characters. You know, people disappear for long periods of time and then come back, and the story goes on all these different tangents, but ultimately it doesn't really matter because the ideas are so much fun and the characters are so much fun. And it felt like a similar thing. And again, that very British kind of feel to it. And it's also something that could also lend itself very well to TV storytelling.
Well, that's it. And I think the influence of Douglas Adams is huge because he is that guy who so many British authors, whether they be science fiction or comedy or what have you, I'm massively indebted to because of the kind of askance view that he gave to the universe and his way of using sci-fi and humour in order to hold things up to ridicule, sometimes in a savage way, but mostly in as gentle a way as possible. And I mean, he starts off, his first real big job was Doctor Who, in terms of being the script editor or showrunner, if you like, of the time for Doctor Who, and pretty much at the height of the Tom Baker era. And you can see his influence right the way through in the likes of Red Dwarf and parts of 2000 AD, in pretty much anything that comes out with British sci-fi from the 70s onwards. And that in itself has massive influence on the rest of the world because the people look to the way that Britain or the British people write stuff. Because we have that post-imperial sense. We have this idea of we used to be great, we're no longer any great anymore, so therefore we can really kind of subject things to very severe scrutiny. And we can dismantle your icons. It's not necessarily always about the optimism, and it's almost always about the cynicism and very, very sarcastic wit.
You get one Shakespeare and you think you're all brilliant bloody writers.
Well, yes, we do. Thank you for noticing. Now, with regards to this, we also have some other interesting potential adaptations coming up, because this is the thing, Preacher isn't on its own. Preacher is one element of the kind of renaissance of comics, or the next phase, if you like, of when comics grew into what they are now. You were saying something about this, comics and Doom and other things like that were the things that when you were in your early 20s that told you that it was okay to carry on with these things that had been a part of your childhood. Yeah. Because there was now properties that were for you, as it were. Yeah,
I mean, similar to what we were saying on the last episode about Doom, the way that these games came along at this point where our generation, us old farts, we were...
Speak for yourself.
I am. Very slowly, because I'm old.
What? What did you say? What?
I don't know. I shit myself.
Oh, jeez.
3:30, dear.
Oh, jeez.
You know, it's sort of, I guess, Generation X. We were moving out of our teens into our 20s. There was things like video games and comic books that we were always told were for kids. And stuff like Doom came along. I mean, and with comics, the Vertigo sort of revolution, actually making comics for adults, these things came along and told us, oh, no, you can still have these things. They're still relevant to you. And yeah, I think it was like this for me and for a lot of other people as well, is we realised, no, we're in this for life.
It was like, for example, one of the forthcoming adaptations, which I really hope gets made, and not entirely sure I hope it gets made the way it's been planned for the moment, but gets made at all, is Sandman. Now, Sandman has been an absolute classic within the whole genre, and again was one of the things that really kick-started that whole movement way back in the 90s. And the idea that there would be a Sandman movie, I would watch the shit out of that, and I hope I wouldn't be disappointed. But equally, I can imagine Sandman doing really, really well as, say, for example, an AMC or an HBO property. Again, forthcoming from this, I mean, one of the subsequent works we've got later on in Garth Ennis' career and Steve Dunn's career is The Boys. Now, The Boys is a Dynamite publication, I think. It's not from Vertigo, but it's still that dark idea. The Boys being this concept that you've got superheroes are real, superheroes are in this world, and they are jerks who behave with absolutely no consideration for what impact their actions will have on the world around them.
Like a Hancock.
Yeah, pretty much. And but they're not. They are still. They behave as jerks, but they also behave unlike in Hancock, where he's somebody who just doesn't care anymore. These are guys who are still allegedly fighting the good fight, but they are ignorant of collateral damage. And the Boys is this group of people who have kind of covertly got access via the CIA to whatever it is the super serum was that powered up these superheroes, and these are the guys who go around and say, "No, we're keeping you in check." And it's an interesting deconstruction of how superheroes work and where they come from and so on and so forth. And it's a really interesting, again, 10-book series, same people. And that's another one of the ones that's in the pipeline, as is the idea of Y the Last Man, which is very simple premise. Suddenly, overnight, everything with a Y chromosome dies. So you've got every male human, every male ape, every male animal, all males just die. And there is one that ends up being left, and we're never quite sure why to start off with. And that series, again, that looks at concepts of, okay, what happens in that situation? Well, suddenly a whole bunch of planes fall out of the sky because more airline pilots are manned. Power systems don't necessarily work like power stations because you don't have enough people to be able to run them. And a large amount of the practical things of society end up breaking down, and you see how that works and what happens there. And these high concept ideas coming through from comic book adaptations into TV, I think it's also an interesting one because it's clearly, these have been around for a while and they finally are being taken seriously. Because it's partly Hollywood fashion. Hollywood has a tendency to do we've rinsed all we can out of this particular thing, what else can we go for?
Thank HBO. That's the short version. HBO kicked off this TV revolution where now suddenly people have realized how long-form TV storytelling is actually perfect for these properties. Because one of the problems before was always condensing these things down to 2 hours, 3 hours, which is why a lot of them didn't work and a lot of them didn't even get made.
But also I would say thank Netflix, because, for example, Netflix, again, differs slightly from HBO. HBO still has the model of you have the week to week to week to week to week, and their stories are created in such a fashion, whether it be Game of Thrones or Boardwalk Empire or The Sopranos or any of those different things. You've got those ideas, but Netflix, with regards to, like, for example, Jessica Jones and Daredevil and Sense8, you have these series that will land and it's a bam, there they are. You can watch this beginning to end and it feels that way. It's less predicated on this idea of there being a week to week and therefore you've got this kind of, there has to be a climactic part of the episode. And granted, no, Game of Thrones doesn't do that either, but most other week to week adaptations, I mean, we mentioned Star Trek right at the beginning of this podcast. Even if you've got plot arcs that go there, there is a structure, there is a beginning, middle, end of your traditional Star Trek episode. And there might be a two-parter, but realistically it's a beginning, middle, end, and it's a chain of episodes rather than one long narrative that starts at one point and ends at the other. Now, that the idea of there being more of that long-form storytelling, that excites me a great deal because it's something different, and it's TV novels. It's stories being told with so much more breadth and imagination. And it doesn't necessarily have to be epic in scale. It can be small, like in the case of Jessica Jones, which, despite it being a superhero movie, is mostly about PTSD and the aftermath of rape and various different things like that, and dealing with small, intimate stories that work so much better because they've got time to be told. I'm really excited with where Preacher is going, and I'm very excited with the future of what we've got going on with these adaptations.
Yeah, it's been a really good start. It was actually quite refreshing to watch it and sort of sit there going, okay, this is really different. This is really, really different. And in the past, that was always a huge red flag. It would always be, oh, they don't get it. They're fucking this up. You know, they're just fucking around with it. But it's really different, but it works.
See, in contrast to another of those kind of DC Vertigo properties, Hellblazer and the Constantine adaptation. Now, that didn't work, I think, partly because of the fact that it was done very much in a traditional TV way, in that Monster of the Week, we've got an on-running arc that kind of goes there, but every episode is entirely self-contained, and it feels like it is just another TV series.
Yeah.
It's like Supernatural's slightly simple cousin.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the source material is not, but this is the problem. Supernatural has a way of being able to do that, and it's slick and it works, and there's sassiness, and the way that Supernatural is put together as a TV show. Yes, it's been telling exactly the same story for 10 years or so, but you know what? They do it effectively. They do it with wit and charm, and it works.
And they do it without their shirts on sometimes.
And that also works for an awful lot of the fans. But this is the point. Constantine is trying to follow that template and doesn't really do it well, because most of the people who don't know the source material will just think, you know what, it's just like it's a Supernatural ripoff. Why am I bothering? Why do I care?
Yeah.
And also it comes from that British 2000 AD heritage where you do it on network TV. They have to change it because the humour and the sarcasm won't really translate quite as well.
And on top of that, this is also, a large chunk of this is based on not only British humour, but Britain in the 80s.
Yeah.
Britain in the 80s is a dark and interesting and twisted place for a large chunk of it. I mean, depending on where you lived. If you lived in the south, where I was living for a large chunk of it, then it was pretty much sunny all the time, and there was a Bentley on every driveway. Well, I exaggerate, but there was an attitude similar to that. But if you go to the north of England with the massive deindustrialisation, it's a cold and dark place where some people that I was friends with weren't absolutely certain that there was going to be food on the table at the end of the day. And the dichotomy that you have within Britain and the darkness associated with that, it's hard to maintain. It's hard to bring to the screen now because it's such a long time ago and it's a different cultural context for many people.
One thing that I'm interested in, because, like, as I said before, I haven't seen it, I haven't read it. I've seen some pictures of the comics and, like, the style that it's in, and it is a very stylized version, like, with the hair and stuff. It's got that kind of 80s feel to it. One thing that I get concerned about, just because of the art background that I have, is how it translates from the comic book to the TV show. As I was looking through the pictures of Preacher, it all seemed to have like very muted colors, and then a lot of yellow was going on, and then all of a sudden there would be like some bright red just out of nowhere, like some guy's tie, or there was like a lady's lapel or a rose, or, you know, someone had a nosebleed, and it was so vivid against all these other colors. And I was just wondering, has that translated over into the show? Is there like a particular feel, or, you know, how in the Matrix things are kind of got that green shadiness? Is that kind of style and art?
At the moment, the colour palette is very similar to the show in the sense that it's very much set in Texas, it's in Anvil, it's in this very kind of dark and, well, it's very dry and dusty.
Yeah.
We're in Australia, we're very familiar with that particular aesthetic, but without necessarily the red earth that you get in Australian outback. You've got it's using very much the same color palette of you've got the browns and the blacks on the lighter browns in the background and the gold and so on and so forth. So it's got the color palette so far very similar to the early early trades.
Yeah, I mean, with the comic as well, in terms of scope, there's a lot of globe-trotting going on. You know, there's certain scenes happening in different countries and sort of very different environments that come up. So I'd imagine you'd start to see that change a bit more on the show as well.
Okay, so before we wrap up, any final thoughts?
Jesse Custer is an anagram of Secret Jesus.
Yes, we mustn't forget that. And don't forget we have the JC initials.
And that boy's face still looks like an arse.
Yes, I was quite pleased. Arseface being one of the central characters in the comic adaptation, that was one of those, how the hell are we going to get that done? Because the facial problems with the character in the comic it's dark and it's twisted. It's one of the darker moments of the whole thing, considering its general dark overtones. That's quite an impressive feat. And the fact that they've managed to get that character with not too dissimilar a disfigurement into the TV show so far, now that bodes well.
It's going to be interesting because, I mean, In a way, Arseface is very much sort of a 90s reference, because it was, I mean, in the comic, he was a Kurt Cobain fan. Him and a mate tried to kill themselves because Kurt Cobain committed suicide.
Right.
Which is why he gets a face like an arse. Now, set nowadays, it's going to be interesting, because to me, Arseface was always kind of, following Kurt Cobain in the 90s, there was that kind of semi-glorification, I think, of suicide. It was all like society was just starting to come around, I think, to understanding things like depression. It was sort of, it first manifested in this kind of almost this glorification, and it always felt to me like Arseface was sort of a rebuttal. Yes. Of that. So it's going to be interesting to see what sort of nouveau Arseface.
I can't believe they've let a character on TV called Arseface.
Well, they haven't necessarily called him Arseface so far on the TV. They call him Eugene because it's his actual name. But in the comic books, he's known as Arseface. And again, they probably won't say Arseface purely for the very simple reason that it's America. They don't understand what arse is.
Mm.
Fanny face?
Ass face. I just wanted to say ass. Come on. Okay, fantastic. We're going to try and wrap things up there. So next time, we are going to be discussing the thorny issue of video game adaptations.
Woo!
Specifically because of the fact that we have the upcoming and imminent release of the Warcraft movie. Meanwhile, if you need to be able to get in touch with any of us, there is the open, public There Will Be Geek podcast group on Facebook. There is also our page that you can subscribe to. You can find us on iTunes. And we are also, albeit not particularly active, but we are out there on Twitter at There Will Be Geek. Cav, where can we find you?
Okay, you could read my stuff in Metro Magazine. Also, not too distant future, other There Will Be Geek related things that are in the pipeline, which we'll go into at another time.
And Chani.
You can find me on YouTube as always, playing all the games as Prima Cat. You can also find me on Facebook and Twitter.
Okay, well, I think that pretty much wraps it up. So one more thing to say. We're finished!